Good day, people. Today I'm reading the preface of The Ancient Tradition of Geometric Problems by Wilbur Richard Knorr, published in 1986. And um, and I should just jump in. Um, uh, I found this book because I thought it was an interesting flip through in terms of shapes and different geometries that this fellow is going through. And and so anyway, without further ado, let me go ahead and jump in because it might take longer than I want it to. Here is a drawing that's at the front that seems to be particularly important, and for some reason he's got these shapes. If one wanted to duplicate the outline of each of those, that would be a particular geometry also, meaning that perhaps is implicit to his choice of covers. So underneath this particular graphic here, right, which is obviously a plant structure, it says included within the medical encyclopedia of Dioscorides from the mid-first century AD is a survey of a plant species and their therapeutic value. The drawing of ivy shown here are taken from the famous illustrated Byzantine manuscript of the work made in 512 AD. So about 400 years, I suppose, and now held in the collection of ancient manuscripts of the Australian National Library. Uh, this reproduction has been made from a facsimile edition of the Codex Demerts Druck and Verlanstalt, with the kind permission of the publishers at the Österreicische National Bibliothek. So I think library. Pardon for I have no basis. Published in New York, Dover. Okay. In any case, so that's an ivy plant. Table of contents. I'll just read the name of each chapter without the subtitles. And the part we're going to be reading is the preface and then the first chapter, Sifting History from Legend. So chapter 2 is called The Beginnings and Earlier Effects, the duplication of the cube, I guess I will read some of the secondary information, the quadrature of the circle, problems and methods. Okay. The geometers in Plato's Academy. Subsection 1, solution of the cube duplication. Section 2, geometric methods in an analysis of problems. Section 3, efforts towards the quadrature of the circle. Section 4, geometry and philosophy in the 4th century. 4, the generation of Euclid, a locus problem in the Aristotelian corpus. 2. Section 4, subsection 2, chapter 4, subsection 2, Euclid analytic works. 3, the analysis of conic problems, some reconstructions. Section 4, an angle trisection via surface locus. Section 5, Euclid's contribution to the study of problems. Chapter 5, Archimedes, the perfect Eudoxian geometry. Once again, pardon my pronunciation. You're welcome. Section 1, subsection 1 of chapter 5, circle quadrature and spirals. Section 2, problem solving via conic sections. Section 3, problem solving via gnosis. Section 4, the anonymous cube duplication. An anonymous cube duplication. Section 5, that should be pretty interesting. Right, I get there. Section 5, the impact of Archimedes' work. Chapter 6, the successors of Archimedes in the 3rd century. Subsection Eratosthenes. Section 2, Nicomedes. Section 3, Diocles. Section 4, on the curve called cissoid. 5, Diosidorus, Perseus, and Zenodorus. Section 6, in the shadow of Archimedes. Okay, so that's 6 of his chapters. He's got a total, it looks like, of 8. So on the chapter 7 is called Apollonius, for Apollonius, excuse me, culmination of tradition. Subsection 1, Apollonius, Archimedes, and Heraclides. When I'm reading in my own head, it's so much different than remembering how other people pronounce these. Apollonius and Nicomedes, Apollonius and Euclid, Apollonius and Aristoteles, and subsection 5, origins and motives of the Apollonian geometry. Thank you. Chapter 8, appraisal of the analytic field in antiquity. Subsection, the ancient classification of problems. Section 2, problems, theorems, and the method of analysis. Subsection 3, and many of the greatest sought but did not find. Section 4, epilogue. Bibliography and then indices. Okay, now on to the premise or the preface. Within the ancient geometry of geometric problem seeks the construction of a figure corresponding to a specific description. The solution to any problem requires for its completion an appeal to the constructions in other problems already solved, and in turn will be applied to the solutions of yet others. In effect, then, the corpus of solved problems forms an ordered sequence in which each problem can be reduced to those preceding. The implications of this simple conception struck me as I was completing a paper on Apollonius' construction of the hyperbola, referencing 1980, published in Centarius, 1982. Excuse me. For it served to unify a diverse range of geometric materials I had then been collecting for some 5 years. The ancient problem-solving effort took on the structure as much what one would expect, given the prominence of the role of analysis for discovering and proving solutions, for this method seeks in each case to reduce the stated problems to others already solved. We possess one ancient work, Euclid's Data, which organizes the materials of elementary geometry in this manner, but there survives none which attempts the same for the more advanced field, the conics, for cones. And Apollonius, for instance, is by its own account ancillary to this effect, providing the essential introduction to the theory of conics through which the so-called solids problem might be solved. But it undertakes the actual solution of such problems only to a very limited extent. This salient omission from the extant record thus defines the project of the present work. to exploit the materials extant from Archimedes, Apollonius, Pappus, Kitty, and others in order to retrieve a sense of nature and development of this ancient tradition of analysis. I've already taken some liberties to put a couple marks here on a couple sentences that I found interesting. The next paragraph says, the present effort is conceived as an exploratory essay intended to reveal the opportunities which the evidence available to us provides for an interpretation of the ancient field. A definitive survey overreaches its scope. That's one mark. However, and may ultimately be unattainable in view of the gaps in our documentation. Similarly, an exhaustive survey of the immense secondary literature on the history of geometric constructions could not be attempted here. The sheer bulk of this literature has made omissions inevitable. But I have endeavored to include references to those contributions which seem to me historically and technically stimulating, as well as directly pertinent to my special objectives. If through inadvertence I have omitted discussions of worth, I apologize for that and welcome information which will prevent similar lapses in the future. Word of the day, vocabulary word of the day, inadvertence isn't mere ignorance, but it's kind of an ignorance like in legal structure. It's like an excusable ignorance of the law, a non-intended violation of law that is not ignorance of the law. It's knowing the law, but inadvertently having to waver and violate the law. Anyway, okay, back to the preface. Second page, last page of the preface, obviously. See how thick this book is? Okay, enough comedy. Since the field of ancient geometry, in particular the work of Archimedes, has been an area of special interest to me for several years, the present study occasionally touches on issues discussed in previous publications of my own. Thus, I sometimes have reason to summarize positions elaborated in detail elsewhere, or to allude in passing to treatments of related issues. In such cases, I have striven to avoid mere repetition of previous efforts, and the present work, but for these occasions overlap, consists of new material. Interesting, nice. In my interpretive efforts here, I will emphasize the mathematical and historical aspects of the ancient writings, while the final chapter will include aspects of philosophical interest as well. Another aspect that dealing with textual issues of documentation, while often overlooked in studies of this type, sometimes become indispensable for understanding the ancient work. I thus include commentary along these lines when it bears on some specific matters taken up here. The broader inquiry of surveying the ancient documents and working out an account of their production and transmission is not attempted here, but forms the project of a separate volume currently in preparation. I intend to examine in that second work a set of Greek and Arabic texts on geometric problems, thereby to reveal the general character of the scholarship which has preserved testimony of the ancient geometric field. Grants from the American Council of Learned Societies and the Institute for Advanced Study enabled me to undertake these researches at the Institute in 1978 and 79, and a grant from the National Science Foundation administered by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences provided support for continuation of this work in 1979 to 1980. I have profited considerably from the criticisms and suggestions of students in the Department of Philosophy at Stanford University, in particular Susan Hollander, Henry Mendel, and David O'Connor. I wish also to thank my colleagues in the departments of philosophy, classics, and mathematics for their comments, and in particular, Sol Pfeifferman, Hazley Roden, Hans Samuelson, and Patrick Supes for reading draft chapters, and Jody Maxson for advice in the presentation of the plates. And I believe he's talking about the initial plate that I would, at least that one of the ivory. In Mueller, University of Chicago provided extensive and valuable comments on the work in its latter stages. I especially appreciate the respect and courtesy with which they all received my effort, which when my positions differed sharply from their own, I am indebted to a number of museums and research libraries for permission to reproduce photographs of items in their collections. These are noted in the captions from the front piece of the plates. A grant from Standard University through the office of its Dean of Graduate Study and Research has contributed towards the cost of publishing these photographic materials. Finally, I wish to acknowledge to support patience and diligence of the president and editors of Berkheiser Boston Inc. Wilbur Richard Knorr, Sanford, California. Okay, now we're into chapter 1. Once again, we're only going to get through chapter 1. I got a lot of stuff to do today, but I skimmed this part, and so I got to knock something out for you guys here. The chapter 1 is called Sifting History from Legend, right? So the first sentence, let me just read this whole page, and then I'll show you what my hang-up there was. The problems of cube duplication, angle trisection, and circle quadrature have deservedly attracted major interest among scholars of ancient Greek geometry. The ancient literature of these problems constitutes one of the most richly documented fields of ancient mathematics, amounting to over 24 different solutions, often in multiple versions and spanning the whole course of antiquity from the pre-Euclidean period through the Hellenistic, Greco-Roman, Byzantine periods, even into the Arabic Middle Ages. Throughout, these problems were affiliated with researchers in the more advanced fields of geometry. A historical survey of these studies could thus be hoped to provide insight of value into the development of the techniques of geometry in antiquity. What were the sources of these interests? What were the sources of the interest in these problems? How did their study relate to prior effects on the same associated problems? How did the results of these studies contribute to the development of new geometric techniques for the solution of geometric problems? What were the precise specifications for the construction of solutions, and did these conditions themselves change with the introduction of new techniques and concepts? Ultimately, did the ancient geometers, not geometers, and philosophers view the quest for solutions as having succeeded? Okay, I'll pause there. Okay, so once again, this is just for the sake of whoever's listening here. The three things he's covering are cube duplication. So, my concept initially, like just upon hearing what he's saying, my first notion of where the complexity arises, first, I guess, has to do with cube duplication. Like he says, so I'm going to draw a couple cubes, see, duplicated at the top, and then, okay, then he says angle trisection, right? So angle trisection, let me put that below there. I would have to do, okay, you put the angle arc in, and then you divvy it up roughly at 1/3 from said angle. So that's number 2. Put a question mark there so you see that one below it. Duplicate, cubes, angle, trisection, and then the last one is circle, quadrature. So he's not saying sphere, he's saying circle. Let's get a circle. Nice as we can here. Okay, and then let me dash down through said, like cutting a pie from the top, looking down on it like an orthographic flatness, and you're cutting it into 4 even pieces, right? So that that is the nature of the last problem. This is just that alone. The scope of circles is impressive. The idea of okay, a squared plus b squared equals c squared for the duplication. The idea of how to split up thirds in the second problem is interesting. Okay, so here we go. So we're just going to continue. Thank you for allowing me my own illustrated thought on what my intuition was about what the problem is here. Unfortunately, only a small part of this project now permits its presentation in the form of a straightforward narrative of how things happened. The extant technical literature has large gaps, so that we cannot claim to know all the solutions to these problems which the ancients worked out, nor even, in some cases, the geometers responsible for solutions which have survived. More difficult still is the assessment of motive, since the documents rarely provide direct insight into the reasons which lead geometers to take up specific problems and treat them in a specific way. For this, we are often compelled to resort to testimonies in non-mathematical writings. But we then face new difficulties in that their authors may not fully comprehend the technical issues, and at any rate will have their own literary or philosophical concerns. The latter will invariably discourage them from presenting the technical materials in the clear and detailed manner we would prefer. One of the important witnesses to the earlier study of the cube duplication illustrates well the hazards of using such non-mathematical sources. It is a passage from The Demon of Socrates, a dramatization of the political conspiracies in the Greek city-state of Thebes in 379 BC, by a writer best known for his philosophical and biographical works, Plutarch of Chaeronea, 1st and 2nd century AD. The speaker here is Simmias, 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 one of the Theban conspirators who is reporting on a recent visit to Egypt he made in the company of Plato. So once again, it's a passage from a book called The Demon of Socrates, and this was put together in 379 BC. Okay, so here we go. Here's the quote. Right, you can see the subsection there. I'm reading on, and once again, this is page 2. Okay, so here we go. As we traveled from Egypt, certain Delians, capital D, Delians came up upon us near Caria and begged Plato as a geometer to solve for them the unusual oracle proposed by the god. The oracle was that there would be a respite from present ills for the Delines and the other Greeks after they had doubled the altar in Delos, which is a city, I guess, capital D. But as they couldn't figure out the purpose and were faring ludicrously with the construction of the altar, For an account of the unfamiliarity with the proportion which provides the double in length, they failed to notice that when each of the four sides was doubled, they were effecting an eightfold increase in the solid space. They summoned Plato for assistance in the puzzle, and he, recalling the Egyptians, said that the god was making sport of the Greeks for their neglect of education, as it were taunting us for our ignorance and demanding that we engage in geometry, and not just as a pastime. For surely is the task not for an intellect which is inferior and perceives dully, but rather for one trained to limit in the construction of lines to take two means in proportion, by which alone the figure of the cubic body is doubled by being increased in the same way from every dimension. It's just like, square, the cube root, but see, the math isn't developed there yet. Being increased in the same way from every dimension. Thus he said, Eudoxus of Synodus and Helicon of Cyzicus, please work out for them. But they shouldn't think that the god wished this, but rather that he enjoined all Greeks to abandon war and its ill and to consort with the Muses. And by soothing the passions through reasoning and mathematics to live together profitably without harm. I'm not even going to try to reread that, but okay, I like that. Now we're back. Okay, Plutarch's chief interest here is to make the point that theoretical disciplines like mathematics, philosophy can be effective diversion from conflict both through the moderating influence on human aggressiveness and through the power that reasoning has for reconciling differences. The very point had been made earlier in the passage alluded to here by the phrase recalling the Egyptian, in which the Egyptian priest had informed certain Greeks that the document they brought to him for deciphering contained an appeal to cultivate the Muses instead of war. But what does Plutarch mean to say about the origins of this mathematical inquiry itself? At first glance, we might suppose he has in mind simply that the geometers in Plato's circle began to study the cube duplication in answer to the puzzle posed by the oracle. In effect, Plutarch would be subscribing to a form of the externalist view under which technical activities find their motivation in factors outside of the technical field, for instance, from political or economic causes, or, as here, from philosophical and religious ones. Indeed, passages like this have been cited by those who would maintain that ritual practices formed an important stimulus for early mathematical studies, or the philosophical discourse provided the first model of abstract reasoning for Greek geometers. But a closer reading reveals that Plutarch does not actually claim this, for his For his Plato already knows certain facts about the problem, specifically that it is equivalent to the problem of finding the two mean proportionals. If the side of a given cube is A, and we have found two lines, x and y, such that A equals A, or x equals x, y equals y, 2A. Then by compounding ratios, we have a x cubed to the third equals x, y, and y to a. Whence a cubed is equivalent here, x cubed equals a. 2a, or x cubed equals 2a cubed. From other sources, in particular, Eratosthenes of uh, Cyrene, 3rd century BC, we learn that the reduction of the cube duplication to the finding of two mean proportionals was the discovery of hippo, because you're going to kill me. I'm going to kill myself over this. Because I sound like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Hippocrates of Chios, of Hippocrates, Hippocrates of Chios. So I apologize for all these particular names, by the way, in the pronunciation. That is, around the turn of the 4th century BC, and thus predated by several decades the event on which Plutarch's narrative is based. Plutarch himself appears to depend on Eratosthenes for his account of the Delenian oracle, for the parallel passage of the cube duplication in a mathematical exposition by Theon of Smyrna, early 2nd century AD, cites Eratosthenes, Platonicus for the same incident of Plato and the Delians, with the same basic point. Okay, now here's the quote. And Plato told them that not for want of a double altar did the god pronounce this to the Delians, but rather to accuse the reproach the Greeks for their neglect of mathematics and their slighting of geometry. And so basically it's another critique from a different time that parallels the earlier critique, I suppose. Aware that Plutarch's source, we thus do well to receive with caution the details of his account. It is clear, for instance, that the chronological association of this story with the uprising of Thebes derives directly from Plutarch's adaptation of the older version. Similar precautions are necessary in dealing with another passage from Plutarch, providing a sequel to the Delenian story by portraying how Plato reacted to the methods of solutions worked out by the geometers. The passage is inserted in Plutarch's description of Archimedes' mechanical achievements, critical for the defense of Syracuse against Rome's siege in 215 to 212 BC. Okay, so now here's that subsection. So he says, this admired and much talked about instrumental art was first set in motion by those around Eudoxus and Artasus, two cities I assume, who embroidered geometry with subtlety, but who, supported by means of perceptible and instrumental models, problems not permitting rigorous geometric demonstration. For instance, in connection with the problem about the two means in proportions, an element necessary for many of the geometric propositions, both of them resorted to instrumental constructions by fitting out certain means, drawing apparatuses from curved lines and segments. But Plato took offense and contended with them that they were destroying and corrupting the good of geometry, so that it was slipping away from the incorporeal and intelligible things towards perceptible ones, and beyond this was using bodies requiring much wearisome manufacture. In this way, mechanics fell out, separated from geometry, and for a long time it was overlooked by philosophy and became one of the military arts. End quote. Okay, as an artist who draws, I use a lot of this kind of instrumentality to measure things, right? And that's what he's critiquing. He's not talking about using, line extensions to basically give feedback, like if you exude all dimensions of a cube, he's saying that those dimensions, you got the six sides, but you also have the x extension and the y extension, such that you would have eight, where the other the meaning the mathematical recursive geometry that is needed to once again define, like, the motivation. What is the motivation of why these people are doing this, right? Like, what problems did they have to solve, right? And so Plato's critique is that they're busy doing these kind of instrumental measurements, and they're overlooking, like, they're not spatializing in their thoughts. They're instrumentalizing, and hence what they're producing is shoddy work, which is probably where the term, good enough for the government came from. Good enough for government work. Okay, anyway, back to the author here. And he goes, okay, Plutarch thus alleges a schism between the mechanical arts and the theoretical disciplines, bridged by Archimedes, presumably for putting into practice his insights into pure geometry. The roots of the division Plutarch quite reasonably assigns to the idealist recommendations of the Platonic philosophy. Indeed, in Plato's Republic, Socrates criticizes geometers for their insensitivity to the true nature of their inquiry. Quote begins here. They speak in a very ludicrous and restricted manner, for they make talk about squaring and applying and adding and all, in a way as if they were engaged in the practice of making all their words for the sake of practice. But surely the entire discipline is studied for the sake of knowledge, and knowledge of what always exists, but not of anything that can ever be made or destroyed. They use the visible forms and make words about them, but their thinking is not about these things, but about what these things resemble. When they make their words about the square itself and the diagonal itself, but not about the one which they draw, and the others in this way, these very things which they fashion and draw, and which have shadows and images of their own, like an artist, they can use them in turn as images in their search to see those things which no one could see other than by the intellect. Once again, like an internal spatial intellect allows people that can properly map the abstracts of geometry as a knowledge set in their mind, and that's different than merely a projection of image, which is part of why I find this interesting, is to undergird my 2D constructions of 3D objects, relative, like this painting is very flat and animated, as opposed to this one of mine, not to make it is very architected, and laid out, but it's not, meaning every stair is slightly larger than the other, and the form of the painting is a little bit more attuned to a geometry, but strictly on in a visual sense, right? So mathematically, when I was painting it, I imagined how the steps must come out, being larger, and then as you go up, or seeing it from this perspective, you would see less and less of the top part of each stair, opposed to the bottom of each stair, for my Cinderella piece here. But okay, and that's my motivation for reading this. We're at 39 minutes. Okay. It is this Platonic sentiment, this conviction of the purity of the objects of true geometric study, which Plutarch captures in his anecdote on the cube duplication. Nevertheless, we can perceive that here too he draws from Erythocines as the intermediary source. For the Archimedes commentary, Eutyches of Asolon, 6th century AD, assigns to Erythocines a long account of the history of this problem, including the following passage as sequel to Plato's meeting of the Deloans. Okay, here we go. And when they, the geometers of the academy, applied themselves diligently and sought how to take the two means of two given lines, Arcesis of Tartium is said to have discovered it by means of half-cylinders, while Eutyches did so by means of a so-called curved lines, But it happened that all of them affected this apodictically, but couldn't construct it physically or put it into service, save some small degree of another guy named Menaechmus, and that with difficulty, end quote. Here, as in Plutarch's version of the geometers busy themselves under the watch of Plato, Arcesis coming up with one solution, Eutyches with another, yet there was a profound discrepancy. Euthyphines deemed their solution to be too abstract and impractical, while Plutarch portrays them as overly mechanical and too little abstract. This kind of discrepancy is one form of evidence adduced by some scholars to discredit Eutyches. Eutyches' assignment of this writings of Erythocines. We will examine the argument later. For now, it is enough to note that the passages can be reconciled in a straightforward way. Two different writings of Erythocines are at issue here. The documents on the cube duplication and Platonicus, it is the latter which Plutarch exploits as his source. The Platonicus was presumably a fictional essay, so that his strongly anti-mechanical position here could have resulted from Erythocines' adaptation of the other, more plainly historical account, where the earlier solutions had no pronounced mechanical element. On the relative value of the mechanical and the theoretical elements in geometry is the attitude of the geometers themselves we would most like to know. The difficulties in learning this from the passages just cited are evident, since the glosses of Plutarch, Erythocines, and 4th century Platonists must first be separated out before the underlying mathematical views can be discerned. Although Plato assigned a prominent role to mathematical studies within his general program of philosophy, that in itself does not qualify him or his disciplines to speak for the technical researchers on the issues which concern them. Indeed, passages like those cited from the Republic suggest that Plato and other philosophers might set themselves apart as critics from the technical field, but if we might try to infer from such critiques that the geometers insisted on this worldly orientation in their studies, we have a variant testimony of Erythocines in the account of the cube duplication. That the earlier studies were cast in an abstract manner. The mathematical text preserved by Eutyches on the methods used by Arcetius of Menaechmus bear Erythocines out on this point. Yet Erythocines' own solution is accompanied by the detailed account of the actual physical device built on its design, and this overtly mechanical element is found in the methods used by Nicomedes and Dio, Diocles, Diocles, together around the same time, late 3rd century BC. It's easy to remember this when I'm reading in my head. Evidently, views on the importance of mechanical approaches varied over the course of antiquity and might sometimes be a matter merely of personal preference. In this lack of unanimous on issues of methodological commitment, the ancient field of mathematics would conform to a pattern familiar in more recent periods in the history of mathematics. These reflections thus reveal three major recommendations bearing on the present study of the ancient problem-solving efforts. Let's get this closer in case my volume is for shit. The reflections thus reveal three major recommendations bearing on the present study of the ancient problem-solving efforts. First, we must attempt to establish the simple chronological sequence of the various solutions. Only thus can we grasp for each period the complex of problems, methods, and aims, which set the directions of geometric research at that time. On the basis, one may hope to discern changes over the long term in the character of the field of research. Typically, treatments of these materials are subscribed to a division by specific problems or by solving methods. Precedents can already be cited from antiquity in the compendium of solutions to the cube duplication presented by Eutychius in his commentary on Archimedes. The book is called Sphere and Cylinder. The writing is in the section of the cube duplication. Sphere and cylinder, right? Okay, because a cylinder is what he referred to. The other guy referred to as cutting a cylinder in half. I believe, like having. Did you say cylinder? If you cut a cylinder in half, of course you're going to get a square on one side. So he's using that probably, meaning if it's if the cylinder is the same height as its width, like a large stump of a tree, like a woodcut stump, right? So it appears square. You could then cut that cylinder, and the cylinder then could be duplicated, and so the geometry of the cylinder is only one instrumental method of this measurement, which I suppose is what this whole critique is here. Okay. In the sections of cube duplication and angular trisections in books 3, and in order to square it, I guess you would want the hypotenuse of the triangle from one corner of the cut to match and duplicate the triangle flipped, right? So that's why the triangles possibly is mentioning here. Wait, I'm overreaching. I'm trying to pick up exactly where he's laying this down. Precedents can already be cited from antiquity in the compendium of solutions to the cube duplication presented by Eutychius in the commentary of Archimedes' Sphere and Cylinder in the sections on cube duplication and angled trisection in books 3 and 4 of Papias' collection, and presumably also in the survey of circle quadrature in Spurius Caria, and in the surveys of special curves in the encyclopedias of Menelaus and Geminius. Among modern discussions, one is most likely to consult the extended chapter on special problems. In T.L. Heath's History of Greek Mathematics, the detailed articles on cube duplication, angle division, and Mucius constructions by R. Bacher in the Polywicio Real Encyclopedia, the long paper on ancient studies of curved lines and surfaces by P. Tannery, and the massive compendium on the history and properties of special plane curves by G. Loria, without questioning the great value of these accounts, as well as many others too numerous to cite here. I nevertheless believe that their principle of organization implicitly commits them to the view that the ancients likewise conceived of the study of these particular curves or these particular problems as distinct subfields that might hold for the encyclopedists like Geminius, or even for commentators like Pappus or Eutychius, but not but not, it seems to me, for the original investigators like Archimedes and Apollonius, and their contemporaries. By contrast, if we adopt a chronological scheme, we can suspend commitment on the ancient conception of the status of these problems and the various solving techniques, so that the conception will be allowed to emerge. The simple chronological questions are in fact often quite difficult to determine, as we shall find. The restrictions to the three classical problems is, of course, artificial itself and will not be adhered to strictly. Its obvious advantage lies in the ample documentary coverage of these problems, touching in some form on each of the major periods of the ancient geometry. This raises the question as to why the three problems continue to attract attention, even after many different solving methods have been worked out. An important key to the answer is found in the changes affecting the general field of research from one period to the next. As new techniques were introduced, their applicability to older problems would naturally come up for consideration. For instance, a special curve generated in the context of a method for the angle trisection might be recognized to have properties relevant for an alternative solution of the cube duplication as well. It is thus clear that one cannot adequately comprehend the approaches adopted in the cases of the individual problems without full regard to the more general environment of research. This presents not a difficulty, however, but an opportunity, for the documentation extant representing the more advanced researches at various times is often quite sparse. One may thus view the special problems as cross-section, suitable for feeling out one's portrait of a wider field. This investigation will occupy the next 6 chapters of the present study, chapters 2 through 7, moving from the pre-Euclidean period through the generations of Euclid and Archimedes to the time of Apollonius. A second recommendation is to devote separate treatment to several important metamathematical issues: how the ancients divided the geometric field according to the types of problems and solving methods, what they viewed the special role of problems to be, especially in relation to that of theorems, and how they associated these with the important methods of analysis and synthesis, what conditions they imposed on the techniques admissible for the solution of problems, and whether they judged that satisfactory solutions for the three special problems had actually been found. More than 3 problems again? Trisection of an angle, duplication of a cube, and quadrants of a circle. Okay, judges satisfactory some 3 problems had actually been found. Historical accounts of these materials also inevitably assume at the outset that the ancients had, at a very early time, distinguished compass and straight edge constructions from the others, and were continually urged on in the quixotic search for constructions of this type for the 3 special problems. And just the idea he's referring to Don Quixote, or quixotic, as the word is a throwback term projected on the ancients. As we now know through results obtained in the 19th century, the ancients were in a position neither to produce such solutions nor even to show, save their persistent failure, that they could not be produced for the latter. is essentially an algebraic question, not amenable to investigation. Under the geometric methods of the ancients, I believe, however, that we cannot assume that the ancient views of these metamathematical issues were just the ones familiar within the modern field, or that even if certain geometers at certain times held views somewhat like those now familiar, all the geometers at the other times necessarily held the same views. Surely our goal must be to discover what the ancient views were by means of a consideration of the relevant historical evidence. That is to project undertaken in Chapter 8, however, as our look at Plutarch's passages on the cube duplication suggests, the search for answers will be far from straightforward. Most of the passages we may consult from later authors whose primary interest is in the explanation of the methodological observations made by philosophers, most notably Plato and Aristotle. For instance, the Neoplatonist element pervades the important Euclid commentary by Proclus, 5th century AD. While much of our evidence must come in the form of interpretations of specific passages from Aristotle by Alexander of Aphrodisias and Themitus, Philoponus, Simplicius, and others. Recall that the passages from Plutarch derive from his discussions with Plato, and that the same is true for his source, Eratosthenes. Even with writers who one might suppose are closer to the actual mathematical tradition, such as Papias, one can readily detect the influence of certain philosophical comments on their mathematical pronouncements. So, he keeps bringing up who had the problem, how they treat the problem, and who the players are, their observational. And the nature of this book so far is an inquiry into the precursors, I suppose, of imagining, obviously, it's imagining geometry, Henderson. This aspect of the commentators helps us to understand an emphasis commonly, but I believe mistakenly made in discussions about the ancient geometry. One seems typically to assume that mathematical concerns were the effective motivating force underlying the efforts of geometers. For instance, that the hallmark of their tradition was the organization of geometric findings into tight structures of deductive reasoning, as if their primary ambition was the production of treatises like the Elements of Euclid and the Conics of Apollonius. But this surely cannot be correct. The writing of textbooks in the end of mathematical research only in the sense that the death is the end of life. It is the last term in the sequence, but not all purposive elements, which explains why one engages in the activity of progressing through the steps in the sequence. As far as an ancient geometers are concerned, the goals underlying the activity of research are in most cases a matter for surmise. In general, I will find most convincing the internalist position that technical research is directed toward the solution of problems arising from previous and current research efforts. In effect, the formalization of problems keeps the field open by guiding new research. To be sure, the goal to rigorize the proofs of known results can stimulate one's form of research. The most notable example of this among the ancients may be found in the mathematical insights of Eudoxius, on which he built the formal theories of proportion and limits. But the exception of Eudoxius The context of the interesting mathematical insights by the ancient geometers lies in such formal concerns, but rather in the investigation of problems. In this respect, I believe the intuition founded on the most recent period of mathematical history can be misleading. The metamathematical inquiries have crystallized into a recognized subfield, the study of foundations, commanding expertise of an entirely mathematical kind. But this did not happen in antiquity. If, for instance, the deductive project embodied in Euclid's Elements entails subtle questions of axiomatics, the ancients seem to have rest content with Euclid's formulation and with the Aristotelian theory to which it loosely relates, for both remain the focus of latter discussions on foundational issues. Third recommendation is to take up the textual issues bearing on our use of the writings from authors from later antiquity. Their editorial effects have preserved for us most of what now survives of the ancient geometric tradition. In some instances, they produce the extant editions of the treatises of great geometers like Euclid, Archimedes, and Apollonius. In others, they compiled uh, miscellanies of geometries resulting drawn from works now lost. It is thus extremely important for us to gain a sense of how these writers handled text. Where did they obtain their text? What changes did they make in them? What were their purposes in selecting and presenting these texts? In this regard, the texts on the three special problems, in particular that of the cube duplication, provide an ideal instrument. Since they survive in multiple versions from several writers, it is remarkable that so little along these lines has been attempted up till now. Even those prominent scholars, J. L. Heidberg and P. Tannery, from whom philosophical issues were a particular concern, did not much explore those questions, which the comparison of these texts might elucidate. It is as if the later writers were of no intrinsic interest to them, and that once one of the several related texts could be accepted as the best, the others might be disregarded. In the sequel following the present volume, an attempt will be made to display the interrelations among the surviving texts of these solutions. One can well anticipate that these writers are not highly original in their mathematical contributions, but the degree to which they depend on sources, not only for mathematical techniques they result, but even for the very wording of the text they present, I believe will be surprising even for those who have made a study of the ancient geometry. This dependence applies as well to Papias as to the other commentators, despite the diversity and advanced level of materials in his collection. Further, the patterns of textual methods will be seen to carry over among Arabic writers in the 19th and 10th century AD. The discussion of several texts on the angle trisection, a cube duplication from Arabic authors, in comparison with selected items from early Greek tradition, will occupy a part of the sequel and its appendices. There will attempt to show that many of these Arabic texts were produced as translations, or at least close paraphrases of the Greeks, even in certain cases where one might have supposed they were original Arabic writings or reworkings of Arabic prototypes. Thus, the derivative character both of this part of the Arabic mathematical tradition as well as the Greek editorial tradition from the Greco-Roman and Byzantine periods becomes clear and suggests that one might hope to exploit them in new ways for gaining insight into the earlier creative phases of Greek geometry. But last is, of course, a project extending well beyond the scope of the present study. Greco-Roman, um, in style, 16 1700s. In this survey of the ancient problem-solving efforts, attention to matters of textual evidence will predominate in Chapter 8 and the sequel study elsewhere. The essential mathematical aspects of the different technical contributions will provide a principal instrument for revealing their historical relations. A difficulty here is that the ancient writers, especially those in the later editorial tradition, preferred the synthetic mode of exposition in their formal treatments of geometry. That is, one derived a claimed result, e.g. a theorem or construction, as a conclusion of a deductive chain of reasoning, which starts from a given terms of the theorem, otherwise utilizes only axioms and other first principles or previously proven theorems and constructions. That's what I meant earlier. To mathematicians of the 17th century, indeed even to some of the ancients, this format was notorious for obscuring the essential line of thought, particularly in the case of more complicated results. But when the discovery of solutions for geometric problems was at issue, the ancients exploited an alternative method, that of analysis. In the case of a problem of construction, for instance, one here posits the design figure as having already been effected, and then deduces properties of this figure until an element of it emerges which is known from prior results to be constructible. The formal synthesis would then begin from these constructible terms and proceed through a deductive sequence in approximately the reverse order to the analysis until the desired construction has been produced. Since the analytic method can be applied fruitfully even where the solution of the problem is not yet known, it is especially well suited for the purposes of geometric research. But the ancients sometimes followed this analytic method in their presentations of known solutions as well. This would doubtless owe to the appropriateness of exposing learners to the use of this method of preparation for their own research efforts later. See, I like it because it's making components or rudiments and talking about just the development of the history and the application of using one method to stack on to the next, but he also talked about the deductive nature. One should be able to build it out and then deduce and reverse the reasoning. It also has advantages in exegesis, seeing that the analysis of the problem exposes in the natural and well-motivated way of rationale behind each step of the construction. By contrast, when only the synthesis is given, these steps often appear arbitrary and without clear motivation until much later in the proof. Thus, in my accounts, I will prefer analytic presentations to synthetic ones. In cases where only the synthesis is extant, I will fashion the analysis corresponding to it, given the close parallelism between these two parts of the treatment of problems. One can recover such analysis with virtually absolute confidence. In doing this, moreover, one can sometimes discern reasons for otherwise puzzling features in the extant synthesis. Nevertheless, the reader should be aware that this is an interpretive element in the account which follows. My intent is not to paraphrase or otherwise reproduce what is already available in the extant primary literature, but rather to bring forward the essential, usually simple, geometric idea underlying each result, and thus to provide an appropriate introduction for further investigation of that literature. This guy's a creep. He's creeping up on geometry. A few terms admitting a variety of meanings in common usage are so prominent throughout this discussion of ancient geometry that I do not dare to employ them in any sense other than their formal mathematical one. This applies to analysis and synthesis, for instance, which will here signify only the special traditional geometric methods mentioned in the preceding paragraph. Similarly, the term problem will refer only to the geometric form of a problem, that is, to the type of proposition which seeks the construction of a figure in answer to certain specific conditions, or the determination of certain properties of a specified figure. It will never be a mere synonym of difficulty, for in fact a geometric problem need not be difficult at all. Its essence lies in its being a project, from probellium to cast forward, project as to projects. That is, a demand to do anything not yet done, or to discover something not yet known. Another such term is prove, along with its cognate noun proof, and the synonyms demonstrate and demonstration, respectively. Here, these refer only to those deductive forms of reasoning employed in mathematics and logic, and will forego their use in metamathematical and historical contexts, where more flexible terms like show, reveal, make evident, and so on will be used in their stead. The serious student of ancient mathematics knows well that the speculative component is necessarily very high. Virtually all the interesting questions we might care to investigate are beyond the range of definite answers, and the same applies even in the instances of many quite trivial matters. It is certain, for instance, that Apollonius wrote the Conics, but the question as to how much of the extant text is Apollonius himself, rather than by his editor Eutocius, has not yet received the attention it demands. In view of this, one ascertains about, in view of this, one's assertions about these materials must always be received within a range of plausibilities and probabilities. A phrase like "one thus sees" signifies a claim of a rather high degree of likelihood, whereas one like "it may well be" signifies a low one. The oddity of our language is that ostensible intensifiers like surely, certainly, and doubtless actually indicate quite the opposite of certitude, but signaling a situation within which doubts can be raised. Their force is largely persuasive, or is largely suasive, but will at least communicate to the reader the nature of my spiritual commitments to my claims. If I sometimes lapse uh, in cautious use of the indicative mode, the reader should be forewarned to supply the needed qualifications. Well, project your own answers. Pick up where he left off, you will. Okay, we're getting close here. In the matter of my interpretive method, I subscribe, however, imperfectly to three simple ideals: to consider all the available elements pertinent to a given question, to advocate that view among all the viable contenders, which best conforms with the general character of the ancient geometric tradition, and with the most straightforward conception of the mathematical field in relation to other disciplines. To prefer that view among viable alternatives which most enhances the interest value of the extant documents, applying these principles can often be a delicate matter. In the case of the first, the mere survival of the document need not compel us to believe what it is. If two commentators happen to disagree at a certain point, we must, of course, try to determine which, if either, is correct, and to explain why there is a discrepancy. By the same token, if the statement of only one commentator is known, that need not be true. Here, the second principle assists the ascertaining whether the testimony might be suspect. If, for instance, Papias asserts something about the geometric field which flatly disagrees with what we find in the technical literature, surely we would not hypothesize a lost corpus of writings merely to make his view correct, but rather we would admit his error and try to figure out why he made it. One can hope eventually to gain a sense of the intrinsic credibility of the various authorities. So besides a six-sided cube, you extend the side out in two axes as well, by the way. Okay, in the various contexts, one quickly learns, for instance, that Archimedes commits no technical errors, and that any assumption to the contrary on our part would be merely preposterous. And one page left. I've got to shut my door and try to keep this under an hour and a half, as lovely as this video is. Okay. Little clown nose here. Okay. The second principle serves to introduce an assumption of economy in interpretation. It is, of course, possible that ancient mathematical thought differed from that of other periods in certain striking and fundamental respects, but I believe we must be forced to search conclusions rather than concur in them, carelessly or even as a matter of principle. It seems to me, for instance, that the technical activity of problem solving in mathematics and other fields is never particularly sensitive to external factors, like the opinions of one or another school of philosophers. To be sure, the line of division may be difficult to draw sharply in some cases, and what starts as external considerations might sometimes, through a very subtle process, become part of the internal conditions of research activity. But I do not imagine the ancient geometers as constantly looking over their shoulders. It is surely absurd to suppose that Platonists, Platonist notions of the perfection of circles induced mathematicians to restrict their solving techniques to compasses, or even that Zeno's paradoxes of motion instilled in Eudoxus a fear of the infinite. The notion that ancient mathematics was somehow a vast exercise in dialectical philosophy must miss a very important point. The geometry is rooted in an essentially practical enterprise of problem solving. As to the third principle, I believe that scholars have a responsibility to keep alive the interest in the documents they examine. It seems to me quite wrong to assume that a certain document is a forgery unless the reasons are compelling, for that will merely guarantee that no one takes it seriously thereafter. Again, it seems to me wrong to assume that certain mathematical writer is incompetent unless we are driven to that view on clear grounds. On the other hand, it is equally important to avoid romantic notions about the expertise of our authorities in the face of clearly contradictory indications. The stature of Pappus as an outstanding mathematical intellect, for instance, has prevented the intelligent use of his writings as a source for the earlier geometric tradition. Again, if one begins to doubt that Aristotle himself produced the extraordinary mathematical reasonings in the Meteorologica, this work might eventually be returned to the mainstream of thinking about ancient mathematical science. It is perhaps in the interest of scholarly precision to approach general theses about the nature of a discipline with skepticism. But most of the major treatments of the ancient geometry, such as that of Heath, have taken that wise counsel too far. They set before us what purports to be a factual narrative of the ancient field, but which is hardly other than a melange of details without strong signs of interrelation or even an internal consistency. The most exciting aspect of this material, in my view, is that the closer examination reveals the general lines of a coherent development, and that the extant record, despite its incomplete state, actually makes sense as a remnant of an extraordinary movement in thought whose basic outline is discernible. If the reader remains unconvinced of the details of this argument in the following study, yet nevertheless comes to appreciate the unsatisfactory state of current scholarship and to perceive the possibility of achieving a coherent view of this movement, then my efforts shall have attained its principal objective. That's the end of the chapter, although he does have all these references to denote his position on this, which I will now continue to read just because it's only 2.5 pages. And what am I thinking? I still have a few minutes to get to an hour and a half. One may consult the okay, so these are notes to chapter 1. One may consult the Oxford Classical Dictionary from 1970 for a brief account of the bibliography of the life and work of Plutarch. 2. Moralia, page 579. The text translation and annotation on this and related passages by P.H.D. Lassie and B. Enerson, Plutarch's Moralia, Cambridge, Massachusetts, London, Lib. The Classical Library, Volume 7, 1959, pages 396 to 399. Okay, so once again, I didn't denote where these indices were noted. I'd have to reread it and then denote that. I'm just reading what these are as we was previously. The ritual background of mathematics is a prominent concern in several articles by A. Seinberg. His Ritual Origin of Geometry, Archive for History of Exact Sciences, 1963, and his Origin, and I'm going to try to skip over page numbers, Origins of Mathematics, Archive for History, Exact Scientists. Some of these ideas have been taken up and extended by B. L. van der Waden, Pre-Babylonian Mathematics, Archive for History of Exact Sciences. The thesis of the philosophical background to pre-Euclidean mathematics, especially in the form of aletic influences of the Pythagoreans, has been championed by A. Chabot, Anna der Greichen Mathematik, Budapest of Munich, Vienna, 1969, translated as The Beginnings of the Greek Mathematics, Derdrecht, in 1978. I have presented a detailed critique of Chabot's views on earlier history of axiomatics. The restriction, the next one. The restriction to given lines A to A is, of course, inessential. One may be, in general, posit lines A, B in any given ratio and obtain A cubed, X cubed equals A, B, as the ancient treatments of the problem are well aware. Euthyphrosydes is cited by Eutychides of Archimedes, Opera, G. L. Heidberg, 3, page 88, also Proclus of Euclid of G. Federline, Leipzig, 2 bar, 1873. Hippocrates' work is discussed in chapter 2. Theon, Exhibition Rerum Mathematicarium, Hiller Lipez from 1878. Plutarch, next one. Plutarch lives. by Margaret Marselius, 14, book 14, 5, 6, chapters 5 and 6. An alternative version of this anecdote mentioning the geometers Architias, Eudokius, who I mentioned, and Menachimus appear in Plutarch's Why Plato Said That God Always Geometrizes, and that's in Moralia. One of the several discussions on topics related to Plato's Timaeus, certain theological overtones present in this version of the Delian story must be due to Plutarch's elaborations of his source narrative, just as the Marselius passage to concern to a link in the story which historical trends in geometry and mechanics must also be his. Next, one may compare the text translation and comments by P. Shorey in Plato, The Republic. Next, Archimedes' Opera by G. L. Heiberg. Next, Notable von Velimitz in Chapter 2. Next, Archimedes' Opera 3, page 78, 88. These are discussed in Chapter 3. Chapter 7. Okay, and then next, consider the following and bold-sounding claim on the practical purpose of geometric investigations. Here's a quote. The graphical solution of problems of construction forms a major goal of geometry, even where this goal seems to be a certain degree to have been forgotten through the advancement of theoretical investigations. Its guiding influence on this investigation is quite easily perceived. The statement is made by the Italian geometer F. Enriquez in an article concluding the anthology of contributions by him and collaborators on advanced questions pertaining to elementary geometry. Questioni riguardanti la geometria elementaria. I have followed the second German edition. By contrast, another mathematician has this to say about the ancient studies of the conic sections. Conics. I believe that one did not, in general, effect practically this construction of the cubic root via conic sections, but that rather it was the theoretical means, as it can also be for us, a means for the extension of understanding. From H. J. Zuzian, Die Geometrics Construction al Extensibris et der Geometrie Mathematique of Annalen from 1896. This essay will be discussed further in Chapter 8. One may expect the same division of opinion on the relative roles of practical constructions and theoretical investigations would still mark modern discussions in the nature of mathematics. Next, Eutocius of Archimedes' Opera, book 3, page 54 to 106, Papias Collection, on Menelaus, Geomenes, and Sporius, those are all three people. T. Heath, History of Greek Mathematics. I will propose further views in the sequel. Heath, History of Greek Mathematics, Oxford, 1921. Bokerwinkel und Christine Lang Polywiskiva in 1961, and Verden-Blatten of Nucius Polynesia from 1962. We'll skip that. Nucius are familiar in the form of sliding marked ruler constructions. See chapters 2, 5, and 6, 10. Pour la historia de lignes et surfaces corbis danuit. Let me scope out here a little bit. Next, the discussion of Nicomedes, conchoid in chapter 6. Next, Heath's treatment in history, page 218 to 220. A distinguished exception to this tendency is a long study by A.D. Steele, Huber de Roys von Zirkel, and Lineal in der Geschichten Mathematik. That's in 1936. Steele blends a careful examination of the ancient sources with a good grasp of the modern algebraic views on these issues. He argues persuasively that the restriction to compass and straight edge was only rarely the explicit condition of the ancient study of geometric problems. Next, for the discussion of reducibility of third-order problems together with a detailed survey of methods of cube duplication and angle trisection, one may consult an article by A. Conti Enriquez in his book Fragen der Elementary Geometry for a discussion of the transcendentality of pi. Also, the historical background, one may consult Callow in the same book in the anthology monographs The Topics of Modern Mathematics in 1911. One may find an article on constructions with ruler and compass by Ellie Dixon and another on the history of transcendence of pi by G.E. Smith. Almost there. Next, the pun is possible in Greek, where the word telos and derivatives carry the various sense of end result, and goal. Aristotle, Physics 2. Next, on Eudicices, chapter 3, the ancient field of the philosophy of mathematics is richer than my statement suggests, but the study seems primarily to have engaged philosophers interested in accommodating mathematical questions within their own favored philosophical outlooks, like Platonism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. The participation of mathematics within this field appears to have been slight, and its influence on their researchers slighter still. This ancient philosophical field is the subject of recent papers and a monograph in process by I. Mueller. We have already alluded to an instance of this attitude in the treatment of the two versions of the Galenian story surviving from Eratosthenes. Next. See instant Carpus remarks on the nature of geometric problems cited in chapter 8. Dissatisfaction with the ancient formal style led several 17th century geometers to consider questions of method and notation. See, in particular, Descartes' geometry. The method of analysis thus served to stimulate the development of new algebraic approaches in geometry. M.S. Mahoney, The Mathematical Career of Pierre D. Fermat, Princeton University Press from 1973. Next, the example is not hypothetical. Next, see the view expressed by Euretes, cited in note 13 above. Next, this is clearly the effect which von Weiselwitz's rejection of Eurydices' document has had, a discouraging use of its potentially significant testimony to the earlier history of cube duplication. Papias repute both as a mathematician and as a spokesman on the nature of mathematics in this issue in chapter 8, and will be further examined in the sequel. Okay, that's the end. I'm just going to make a quick commentary that my interest in geometry, and as this kind of a discursive investigation into the pre-motivations of how one is to do some basic geometry, not merely as a spatial representation, but it also has to do with very complex geometries when one is measuring their ostensible empirical field in their mind. And why is that important to me as a part spiritualist who would argue that we're inside of like a simulation theory where not only coincidences of symbols occur, but coincidences of color fields, and moving colors, um, and that there are geometric strata that you could make between numerology, the parallelism between numerology as a symbol and how it parallels language in terms of a semantic read, versus something like saying 81. If you see 81 in a field, it could be a coordinate system, but it could also just mean 8, like an infinity sign, and 1 meaning one individual, right? So it's a meta that my interest in this, but besides everything I can get from this reinvestigation of geometric primitives that this book is seemingly going to shore up for me. My interest, um, once again, is on one's when one sees all of the data in their universe as a recursive, reflexive end point, meaning right when you see the data, you can, in your mind, from the individual subjective phenomenal field, phenomenological field, meaning your consciousness, your relationship to grammar at large, your relationship to geometry and geometric space, the field of being able to concretize um, a first an abductive read of all elements, both symbol, directional, as a space orientation and projection in your mind outward. This might sound, try to follow me here. Meaning, as one is moving through their world of space, they can start finding coincidences between symbols of items, common symbols of items, movements, figurative movements. And so what I mean is one can develop what I believe to be a space in their